Hello. The essay that is prescribed for detailed study in the school of criticism known as postcolonialism in your criticism and theory paper is Jane Austen and Empire, an essay by the critic Edward Said, who argues in this work that the novel Mansfield Park reflects the assumptions of early 19th century British imperialism. This is an essay that appears in the collection known as Culture and Imperialism, a work in which Said points out the powerful role that culture plays in keeping imperialism intact. He argues that it is through culture that the imperial powers authoritatively maintain their, their right, their divine right to rule the colonies. The institutional, economic, and political operations of imperialism depend heavily on the moral power provided by culture. It is, in fact, the civilizing mission that sets apart the modern imperial powers from the earlier Roman, Spanish, or Arab empires. Said stresses that while the establishment of empires by the active colonization of territories has more or less ended, imperialism actually lingers where it has always been, in a kind of general cultural sphere, as well as in specific political, ideological, economic, and social practices. Its very investment in culture makes imperialism a force that exists far beyond geographical empire. So, pointing out the link between culture and imperialism, Said argues that culture is the power which changes a colonized people's view of the world without the colonizer having to uh, resort to military or any other kind of physical control. Said's argument in the work is that imperialism is not just a moment in history. It is, in fact, a continuing interdependent discourse between subject peoples and the dominant discourse of the empire. Even though colonialism had ended with the colonies gaining independence, the unstated assumptions on which empire was based lingers on, argues Said. And these assumptions just suppress the visions of a world where there is no domination. It just denies the existence of a world of equality and justice. So, Said believes that it is important to have an awareness of this kind of continued domination so as to transform the whole idea of the empire. And it is with that intention that in the work Culture and Imperialism, he undertook the reading of early works, 19th and 20th century English and French works like that of Jane Austen, Kipling, Conrad, Camus, and E.M. Forster. Edward Said is normally considered as one of the earliest among the critics who have critiqued the empire and its aftermath. His writings are generally considered as the earliest among those which we today label as postcolonial, works which may have various perspectives and subject matters, but which largely deal with or are concerned with the experience of exclusion, of being insulted, of denigration, and of resistance against the systems of colonial control. So one can understand the term postcolonial as referring to the various historical, political, cultural, and even textual representations and manifestations of the encounter between the East and the West, dating from as early as the 16th century and continuing all the way up to the present. So, postcolonialism is something that considers how this encounter between the East and the West, or the colonized and the colonizer, how this encounter has shaped uh, everyone who has been part of it. That is, both the colonized and the colonizer. So, in very broad terms, one can consider postcolonialism as a term that is uh, that can be applied to a critical, a theoretical approach in literary and cultural studies, which designates a politics of transformational resistance to the unequal forms of political and cultural authority exerted by the West on the East, the colonizer on the colonized. The term postcolonial is largely used in two different ways. On the one hand, we think of it in a very chronological manner, that is, using the term postcolonial to refer to time, to a period of time, and mainly the period after um, colonialism, that is, post colonial. And in the sense, we think of the term post colonial as referring to the period of time after 1947, the year in which India, one of the major colonies, became independent, paving the way for other colonies to lead their movements for independence. Now, the other sense in which the term postcolonial is used is to use it to refer to anything that protests against, that questions the period of colonization. So, looking back at the period of colonialism and theorizing that condition. And in this sense, the term post colonial, it became uh, more current after or somewhere towards the end of the 1970s, when the works of critics like Edward Said became quite popular. So, in that sense, postcolonialism may be considered as, to quote the works of Peter Brooker, the study of the ideological and cultural impact of Western colonialism and its aftermath, sometimes as a continuing influence and sometimes as the emergence of newly articulated, independent, national, and individual identities. So, in this sense, postcolonialism also involves going back to one's roots, reasserting one's uh, identity, countering the colonialist ideology and the Eurocentric universalism that it conveyed, that which prioritized the Western and devalued the East and its traditions, questioning all such stance. So, in that sense, postcolonialism may be considered as that which questions, overturns, and critiques colonial authority, its epistemologies, its forms of knowledge, its forms of violence, its claims to superiority, and it refers to all those theories. Postcolonialism refers to all those theories, texts, political strategies, and modes of activism that engage in any such questioning. That is, that which aim to challenge the inequalities and bring about a kind of social change. So, one can broadly see as the aims of postcolonialism a very close examination of the history of colonialism from the perspective of the colonized. That is, looking at history not as it was till then done through the perspective of the colonizer, but through that of the colonized. So it also aimed to determine the economic, political, and cultural impact of colonialism on both the colonizer and the colonized, and then to critique every form of domination that colonialism brought with it. Postcolonialism also rejected the imperial domination. It questioned the Eurocentric point of view of the colonizer, and it celebrated the return to the indigenous literary and cultural traditions in the works of the the writers of the colonized countries. So, postcolonialism broadly questions and revalues the literary and cultural canon in Western institutions through an agenda of multiculturalism rather than the unitary, one sided Eurocentric vision. A kind of multiculturalism is upheld by postcolonialism. So, postcolonial literature and criticism arose both during and after the struggles for independence in the nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which are together known as the tricontinent. So, it was in 1950 that one of the major texts of postcolonialism came out, written by Amy Césaire and the other one, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. In 1958, we have the publication of what is generally considered, the first post-colonial novel, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. This was followed in 1961 by Fanon's next major work, The Wretched of the Earth. And then in 1966, we have the launch of the journal, The Tricontinental. The critic Robert Young considers this the founding moment of postcolonial theory. The launch of this journal Tricontinental by the Haven Tricontinental of 1966. It initiated the first global alliance of the peoples of the three continents against imperialism. In 1978 came out one of the most important of postcolonial texts, and that was Edward Said's Orientalism. And this was followed by The Empire Writes Back in 1989, written by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin. 1990 again saw the publication of Spivak's The Postcolonial Critic and Homi Bhabha's The Nation and Narration. So, among the postcolonial critics, Edward Said has more or less the role of a pioneer, known now as a literary and cultural theorist. Said was born in Jerusalem in Palestine, and having completed his education in Jerusalem and then Cairo, he moved to the United States where he finally became a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. Now, Said was much influenced by Foucault's idea about power operating through systems of knowledge, including the gathering and cataloging of information. And he applied this to the ways in which colonial authority was exercised in the colonies by the imperialist nations. Articulating clearly the cultural position and the task of the intellectual and literary critic, Said had disagreements with the way in which he saw structuralism, post structuralism, and deconstruction to rather isolate literature from its social and political context and to reduce even these contexts to a kind of textuality. So he examined the historical production and impulses of all Western discourses, particularly about the Orient and about the Islam in particular. And he also, was very strongly committed to bring to light and clarify the struggle of the Palestinian people to regain a homeland. So Said believed that literary criticism in the post structuralist era had retreated into a kind of a textual labyrinth and that it had just become an institution that affirmed the values of a Eurocentric culture, which was hegemonic, dominative, and elitist. It had somehow lost touch with the heterogeneity of civil society. Said countered the post structuralist idea of the text as something that is divorced from the world, and he redefined the text as something that is totally worldly. He said, texts are a system of forces institutionalized by the reigning culture at some human cost to its various components. So, in a very Foucauldian manner, Said saw culture as that which fixes the meanings of words like the center, the home, belonging, the other, community, and so on. So, Said wanted to carve out a space within civil society for the intellectual and critic, a kind of in between secular space. Said advocated a kind of criticism that was different from every other kind of cultural activity or totalizing system of thought, and one that focused on the local, focused on the worldly situation, and opposed any kind of master narrative. He believed that criticism must combat every form of tyranny, domination, and abuse, and promote a kind of non-coercive knowledge that promoted human freedom and articulated possible alternatives to the prevailing systems of culture. So these ideas of his were expressed through his major works like Orientalism, which came out in 1978, and then The Question of Palestine, covering Islam, where he talks about the way in which the media has determined how, the Western media has determined how we see the rest of the world, particularly Islam. Then a major text called The World, the Text and the Critic, Culture and Imperialism, 1993, and The Politics of Dispossession. In his major works like Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, Said examines the vast tradition of the Western constructions of the Orient. He points out how Orientalism has been nothing less than a corporate institution that authorizes the Western views about the East and provides a kind of justification for its ruling over the East. He sees it as a kind of a Western discourse, a construct which provides a self-definition of Western culture and also justifies the imperial domination of the Oriental people. It projects ideas about the East and the people of the East through the various newspapers, their studies, their the laws that they formulated, the censuses that they compiled, and so on, and conveyed the idea of the Easterners as a kind, as in a stereotypical manner, as rather weak-willed, inferior, secondary, effeminate, and totally unable to rule over themselves. So it was a kind of systematic disciplining. Orientalism was a kind of systematic disciplining, a discourse, which functioned, as pointed out earlier, as a corporate institution for understanding and controlling these people. So it was a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, says Said. It depended on an absolute distinction being made between the dominant colonizing West and the underground selves, the other people. Uh, and these others included, everyone in the worlds other than that of Europe. The Africans, the Caribbeans, the Asians, the Latin Americans. In fact, anyone who did not conform to the value laden image of the dominant European self. In Culture and Imperialism, Said argues that power and ideology work both in a conscious and sometimes unconscious manner to form and maintain a kind of system of domination which is even more potent than military force. He discusses some of the key cultural productions of the West, including novel, literature in general, the novel in particular, and even opera. All of these cultural forms he sees as subtly expressive, both stylistically and symbolically, of imperial dominance. Extending the argument of the earlier work, Orientalism, the essays in Culture and Imperialism continue to describe the ways in which the modern Western world um, exerts its presence, its power, and its domination over the earlier the earlier colonial territories long after those colonies had attained independence. And to do that, Said revisits some of the accepted and acknowledged classics of Western literature, particularly novels like um, Robinson Crusoe, Camus' The Stranger, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, and in even an opera, Verdi's Aida, to convey how there was this hold that the Western world, the imperialists had this hold over culture, whereby they had a kind of devastating influence on the colonies that they ruled over. So he makes what he calls a contrapuntal reading of these works. The word contrapuntal actually is borrowed from the field of Western classical music, where you have various themes playing off one another, with only a slight privilege being given to any particular theme. So, in what you have as a result of that kind of coming together is a polyphony, which in a concert where you have an organized interplay that derives from all the themes together, and by subjecting these works, these novels, to a contrapuntal reading, what Said does is to take into account their polyphonic dimensions. Instead of making a conventional, one-sided, univocal reading, he undertakes a contrapuntal reading because he believes that such a reading alone will enable the establishment of a counterpoint between the imperial narrative and the postcolonial perspective on these works. So, a contrapuntal reading takes into account the intertwined histories and perspectives to interpret colonial texts from the perspective of both the colonizer and the colonized. Therefore, what he ends up doing is interpreting different perspectives simultaneously and seeing how the texts interact. The text interacts with itself, as well as with historical and biographical context. So, in other words, it is like looking at an issue from all sides. It addresses both the perspective of imperialism and the resistance to imperialism from the natives. So, a contrapuntal reading necessarily conveys the idea of a vision in which imperialism and literature can be viewed simultaneously. And that is why Said has chosen these well known classics. He calls them estimable and admirable works of art and living. He says like other readers, has taken great pleasure and derived great profit from these works. And the challenge, he says, was to connect them not only with that pleasure and profit, but also with the imperial process of which they were manifestly and unconcealedly a part. So he goes beyond an artistic or aesthetic reading of these novels to make a political reading and to highlight how these works, these classics of Western literature, in fact, conceal a kind of imperial process. In other words, they and their authors are probably can be seen as complicit in the project of imperialism. They were as much partners to it as the politicians who practiced imperialism. In fact, many years after these novels were written. So he suggests that we need to make a close reading of these novels to learn about the hitherto ignored aspects and to thereby truly enhance our reading and understanding of these texts. So that is how it becomes a post-colonial reading of an earlier text. When Said points out the undeniable link between culture and the imperial enterprise, he does not mean that forms of culture like literature led directly to imperialism, but that these works actually do validate imperial tendencies even before imperialism itself became a reality, during the 19th century. Many literary works of mainstream European culture, the kind that he reads in this work, he says, stress the importance of, a place like a well-governed home, a nation of proper order, good behavior, and moral values, contrasting it with another land, a land that is not so well structured, a land that does not have too much of order or good behavior about it. So, um, one can see that one can actually see this imperialist phase in these works even before the actual establishment of the empire in the last part of the 19th century. One can find traces of that empire in these 18th century works. And he goes to the extent of saying that even the anti French sentiments that are seen expressed in many of these English works are actually uh, can actually be seen as a sign of imperialist tendencies, because imperialism is in a sense a kind of expression and an expansion of uh, a feeling of nationalism. Edward Said reads Mansfield Park as a text that is complicit in the project of imperialism. Now, the introduction into this work gives us an idea about his concept of, his understanding of imperialism, which is nothing but a strategy whereby a state aims to extend its control forcibly beyond its own borders over other states and peoples. And this control is normally done at three levels: a military level, an economic level, and then, most importantly, a cultural level. The ruling state imposes its terms of trade, its political ideals, and its cultural values, including its language and its heritage, on the subject state. So, Said defines imperialism as thinking about or settling on controlling land that you do not possess, land that is distant, that land that is lived on and owned by others. He argues that imperialism has survived the disappearance of the colonial empires, and therefore, in this work, in Culture and Imperialism, he devotes the last section actually to to an analysis of the power that the United States wields over the rest of the world, particularly after the Second World War. Edward Said reads Mansfield Park as a text that is complicit in the project of imperialism. Now, the introduction into this work gives us an idea about his concept of, his understanding of imperialism, which is nothing but a strategy whereby a state aims to extend its control forcibly beyond its own borders over other states and peoples. And this control is normally done at three levels: a military level, an economic level, and then, most importantly, a cultural level. The ruling state imposes its terms of trade, its political ideals, and its cultural values, including its language and its heritage, on the subject state. So, Said defines imperialism as thinking about or settling on controlling land that you do not possess, land that is distant, that land that is lived on and owned by others. He argues that imperialism has survived the disappearance of the colonial empires, and therefore, in this work, in Culture and Imperialism, he devotes the last section actually to to an analysis of the power that the United States wields over the rest of the world, particularly after the Second World War. Zaid takes up for his contrapuntal study the novel Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, since he believes that among her novels it is the one that is most explicit in its ideological and moral affirmation. And following the analogy of the country and the city used by Raymond Williams, Edward Said here directs our attention to the important concept of space in the novel. You know, Mansfield Park is that space, the central image that has great significance in the novel. As we know, the novel traces the story of Fanny Price, the poor niece of the Bertrams, who are the owners of Mansfield Park. And it traces her journey from a life of poverty to one of wealth. as she moves from Portsmouth to Mansfield Park, which she ultimately becomes the owner of. She becomes the mistress of Mansfield Park. And therefore, her movement from the littleness and the poverty and the cheap squalor of her Portsmouth residence to the refinement and the luxury of Mansfield Park can be, seen parallel to the uh, to the journey that countries like England undertook during their uh, process of empire building. Just as the novel conveys the idea that poverty brings with it confinement and meanness of spirit and so on, and that one should look for ways of moving out of that kind of poverty. Therefore, the novel anticipates and kind of, in a sense, justifies the colonial tendencies of acquiring larger fortunes in order to improve the quality of life. That is exactly what the colonies did. They saw no wrong in acquiring property in different parts of the world just for the sake of improving their own life. So this is the idea that is repeatedly brought home in the novel. One can think of that instance, for example, where you have one of the Bertram daughters demanding, the shawls to be brought from India. So at every stage, you have this idea that the colonies need to labor and that it's perfectly all right to exploit that labor in order to make one's life very comfortable in England. So, the novel is set in Mansfield Park, this estate owned by the Bertram family, whose wealth derives from the sugar plantations that they own in the Caribbean island of Antigua. But, Edward Said notes very clearly that there is almost no mention of Antigua in the novel. In spite of the fact that the story depends on Antigua and the wealth that comes from Antigua, the holdings, in the colonies, the Bertrams, they would neither be rich nor powerful if they did not own the sugarcane plantations in Antigua. But there is hardly any mention of or any the novel does not take us to Antigua at all. In fact, it focuses on the fine, the refined, very cultured kind of life that is represented by Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park is the story of Fanny Price and the journey of her life, the journey from Portsmouth to Mansfield Park, her journey from poverty to wealth and individuality. But it is equally well the story of Sir Thomas Browne, her uncle and the owner of the estate of Mansfield Park. Now, he is away most of the time in the novel because we know that he's away in Antigua, in the Caribbean island of Antigua, uh, looking after his sugarcane plantations there. Now, every time he returns to Mansfield Park, the novel stresses upon the return to order. Any sign of trouble, any sign of any problem in the estate is just put right the moment Sir Thomas Bertram returns. So the novel, says Edward Said, leads us to believe that what he does on the estate, the restoring of order, bringing perfection to the running of the estate, and uh, restoring it to a sense of harmony and goodness and perfection, is probably parallel to what he does on a much bigger scale, on a larger scale, in his Antigua plantations. We can assume, says Edward Said, that in exactly the same way in which he puts order back in Mansfield Park, he would probably have dealt with issues on the island and would have fixed the problems there, and maintained his control over his colonial domain. So, this, according to Edward Said, is a brilliant expression of the way in which Jane Austen can be seen to synchronize the domestic world, of which she is conventionally considered to be the authority. We've always considered her as the writer of the domestic sphere. But here, Edward says that it's not just the domestic sphere that she is the writer of. Through that, through the way she writes about, in the way that she writes about the domestic sphere, one can see an attempt to synchronize it with international authority. In other words, the domestic sphere of Mansfield Park is parallel to the international or the colonial space of Antigua, and the values associated with, like higher things like order, law, propriety, must be grounded firmly in actual rule and possession of territory. So we can also see the ways in which the novel seems to indicate, says Edward Said, when you give it a close reading, that the domestic tranquility, the attractive harmony that is so characteristic of Mansfield Park, is nothing but a result of the productivity and the regulated discipline of the other. So, in justifying and in glorifying the beauty of this domestic sphere, one can see that the novel is in a way justifying and glorifying the colonial enterprise, which is responsible for the wealth and the perfection that is the hallmark of Mansfield Park. The lasting impression left by the novel Mansfield Park is, of course, that of the estate of Mansfield Park. However, uh, the lasting impression left by the novel Mansfield Park is, of course, that of the estate of Mansfield Park. The estate that is a space which symbolizes perfection, order, goodness, and nobility and perfection. However, we know that this order and this perfection is directly connected to the wealth that comes from the Caribbean island of Antigua and the sugarcane plantation owned by Sir Thomas Bertram in Antigua. However, the novel does not ever take us to Antigua. It does not show us the reality of the situation in Antigua, nor does it allow any one of the slaves to feature as characters here. We know that the slaves labor day in and day out to make the kind of life portrayed on Mansfield Park possible, but portrayed in Mansfield Park, the estate of Mansfield Park possible. But that is never shown. The labor of the slaves is never shown. The novel seems to turn a blind eye to that world, and therefore, the author sees, or Edward Said sees this as a kind of a very significant thing in the way that the novel turns a blind eye to the reality of the slaves' situation in Antigua. One can see the way England justified, saw itself as totally justified in exploiting the wealth of its colonies in order to make life in England more comfortable and more perfect. Further, the choice of Antigua, again, it's not a very innocent act according to Edward Said. It is in fact a way in which the author or the novel actually proclaims a sense of pride or a national pride, a sense of nationalism. Because Antigua is an island which was known for its sugarcane plantations. And the industry of sugar was one that witnessed keen rivalry between the colonial rivals, England and France. So, in asserting its authority over Antigua, in asserting, the presence of Sir Thomas Bertram in Antigua, in a way, the novel is also triumphantly proclaiming the superiority of England over France. One can see it as, pointing towards that. It is in that sense that Edward Said reads the choice of Antigua. He does not see it as a very innocent or a very casual setting. There is a strategy behind it, or there is a political and historical sensibility that goes behind the choice of Antigua as the island or the place from where the wealth flows towards Mansfield Park, flows to Mansfield Park. So, Edward Said concludes that, even an author like Jane Austen, who is conventionally considered to be a painter of domestic scenes, who conveyed the domestic sphere in the best possible manner, actually had a political and historical sensibility, and that a kind of sensibility that anticipated it very clearly anticipated the official age of empire, in which writers like Kipling and Conrad, they were to write about novels about only much later. So, in a way, he considers a novel like Mansfield Park and an author like Jane Austen also, to a great extent, to be complicit in the imperialist project. He says that the novel, on a close contrapuntal reading, can be seen to open up a broad expanse of domestic imperial culture, without which the subsequent acquisition of territory would not have been possible. In other words, it projects to us the domestic the domestic space that glorifies and justifies imperialism.